All right, hello and welcome to week 2 of the course. All kinds of developments with COVID and the plans. It looks like we're going to be online for at least 2 more weeks, and it's going to be up to me and the TAs, and maybe I'll send out a poll to decide whether we go back in person at all. Um, at this point, it's possible that, it'll be more disruptive and annoying to sort of be switching halfway through the quarter. So I don't know. Well, I'll decide. I'll let you folks know um, well in advance. And if anybody has any thoughts about it, please let me know. Regardless of what happens, it will be possible for you to take the course remotely, regardless if you happen to be in another country or something, right? The only difficulty I've run into with some folks is they are having trouble getting the book. Yeah, it's a tough one. The academic publishing industry is such that this particular publisher has gotten very good at locking down. I haven't found any PDF copies anywhere. Um, I'm not allowed to like scan the book and give it to you. It's illegal. I can get in trouble. So they're really they've gotten pretty good at making you pay for this one. I'm sorry, but we need a textbook for this kind of course. So hopefully you can get the textbook. If it's coming, but it's slow, let us know. We'll try to accommodate you as much as we can. All right. So this is the second part of chapter 2, evaluating theoretical hypotheses. This lecture is a bit long. I hope not to go too far over the normal lecture time of 50 minutes. If I happen to, I'll try to make the next one shorter so that you're not sitting in lecture for more than you normally would in an in-person course. But there's a lot going on in this lecture. Um, the exercises are going to be largely like this is telling you how to do these exercises. So I would pay attention to this one, slow it down to normal speed, right? And actually pay attention. Maybe put away your phone. Okay. Right, so here we're setting up, we're going to develop a general strategy for evaluating scientific hypotheses that folks like us, non-specialists, can use just when we read about it in a magazine or a newspaper article. Right? So, big picture, the idea is that, as you may have suspected from watching the first half of this, um, what's going to help to set, what's going to tell us or give us information about whether a model likely fits the real world is whether there is agreement between the model's predictions and the data that we discovered through an interaction with the world, right? Um, Either might happen, it might agree or it might disagree, and our strategy is going to tell you what to conclude in either case. Um, we'll start with cases of disagreement because it ends up being a little simpler, a little shorter, the analysis. Um, Now, it can be sometimes just hard to tell whether the data and the predictions agree, right? If something is if the issue is very technical and the experimental setup is fairly complicated, and even the experts are arguing, right, about whether the data agrees with the prediction, um, it the stuff might get over your head, right? In those cases, the thing for us to do is just suspend judgment. Um, so this headline is an example of the sort of thing that you'll see on right CNN or whatever, right? Breastfeeding linked to lower blood pressure in toddlers. You see these sorts of things all the time. These are the sorts of reports that we ought to learn. This general scheme is going to teach you how to read them and get provided that they've even given you enough information to analyze it, you should be able to analyze this stuff and decide whether there actually is any support for this hypothesis and then once we get to decision theory, what that means you should do, make any changes to your own behavior based on that information. Starting with situation where it looks like the model does not fit the world, right? There's disagreement between the data and the prediction. Um, we saw one of these in our introductory story of Watson and Crick and their discovery of the structure of DNA, right? There was one model, the three-chain model, that it turned out the predictions did not fit the data, right? Uh, the decisive data in that story were Franklin's experimental measurements of the amount of water found in DNA samples, right? So the three-chain model makes a prediction about how much water a DNA molecule could accommodate. It's actually kind of straightforward, even with the scale model they build, right? If you know anything about the size of water molecules, you could calculate, right, how much water could be contained within the DNA helix. The three-chain model predicted about 1/24th of the amount actually measured by Franklin, right? So this is a pretty clear case of disagreement of the prediction of the model, right, with the actual data. Here is Franklin herself, right? So now we ask, is the model false, right? Does the model not fit the world? It's tempting to say, yeah, it's false, right? The data was falsified. The prediction was falsified, rather, by the data. And so, yeah, the whole thing's false. We, as lay people and even as scientists, we should be a little more careful than this, right? There are other possibilities. Some of these possibilities go beyond our abilities as non-specialists, right? So it's possible the data is mistaken, right? Particularly, right, experiments requires a lot of care, right, and a lot of careful design to make sure that, right, the interaction with the world is producing exactly the sort of data you're looking for. There's lots of things that can go wrong, especially if you're using, right, special equipment. There's plenty of ways just the equipment can fail, right? So that's always a possibility, right? Could be that the readout was mistaken, right? Something malfunctioned. Something about the experimental design was faulty. For the purposes of this class, right, we as, again, non-experts are not going to be able to qualified to judge that. So we just have to leave that open as a possibility, right? Say, well, yeah, it's always possible that the data is mistaken, but I can't decide that. It might also be possible that the prediction itself was mistaken, right? It might be the case that the model does not entail that particular thing. Maybe the experimental apparatus and the way it works was misunderstood in some way. So someone made a mistake when deducing from the model what sort of, right, data they should expect. You can make a mistake there as well. So because of those possibilities, right, even when we seem to see clear disagreement between the data and the prediction, we're just going to say that the data provides good evidence that the model is false, right? Leaving open the possibility that something went wrong and actually the model actually is true. Right? So what about if there is agreement, right, between the prediction and the data? So the double helix model, right? So they abandoned the three-chain model. Now we're on the two-chain model. That's got plenty of room for the amount of water that Franklin found, right? So, okay, great. So have we confirmed it now? They agree, right? Well, Watson and Crick didn't count that as evidence for the model. So why not? Well, there's lots of actually different ways to accommodate that amount of water. You could do it with a three-chain model if you put the bases on the outside. If you recall, that was a question for them for a while. Where do the bases go? Are they inside the chain? If so, how do they match up in a way that keeps the chain right, uniform throughout? Do the bases go on the outside? They decided on the inside. But, so there's lots of different ways that to make the model, to make different models accommodate that data, right? And for that reason, they didn't hang their hats on the amount of water matching up with the two-chain model. Instead, they were more impressed by the X-ray photographs. So you may recall they made a prediction about what the photograph should look like from a two-chain model. It was in the previous lecture slides. There was like like more like squares, right, that sort of resembled this photo here. So they calculated that a double helix should produce a pretty distinctive image, right? So even a slightly different molecule would not produce this image, right? So when they do take the X-ray photographs and it does in fact look like their prediction, this to them is much better evidence than the amount of water agreeing, right? There's really much less room for error. Not as many different models could produce this same data. So in this case, the agreement between the data and the prediction would be very unlikely if their hypothesis was false. So this brings us to an important point, right? So mere agreement between the data and the prediction, that's not enough to think that a hypothesis is true. The agreement should only count as support for the model when the agreement would have been very unlikely hypothesis were false, right? Um, so this may seem to be a problem as well, right? So no matter what the data happens to be, couldn't you always come up with another model that happens to make the same prediction? Um, and if so, could we ever say that a model fits the world? Because there's always another option, right? Well, in principle, ultimately, yes, right? But in practice, right, in actual scientific practice, um, we don't run into this problem as often as you might sort of in principle, right? So typically, not every logically possible model that would predict the data is going to be plausible, right? Given all of sort of the background information scientists have. Um, Now that's difficult sometimes for non-specialists, right? Again, to determine. Um, Often when we're analyzing these, we're going to depend on the reports, right, to tell us whether there's another model, right? If the reports don't mention another model, then sometimes we'll have to just trust them that there isn't another plausible model, right? Um, we'll notice some other instances where it's fairly easy, particularly when we consider pseudoscience, or what we'll call in this course marginal science. In some cases, it can be pretty obvious that there's another explanation for the data, right? Um, but in a lot of other cases, we're just relying on those reports, right? Do they tell us there's a competing model? If not, and if we can't think of one, um, then we'll just have to assume that there isn't. No, in principle, logically, yeah, there's sort of like an infinite number of other models. All right, so here is the program for evaluating the theoretical hypotheses. It's going to be a 6-step process. The first 4 just sort of help us carve up and identify the basic parts of the scientific episode that we're going to analyze. Um, and then the final 2 steps will help us evaluate whether the episode provides support for a model or whether it shows that a model is not supported, right? So here are the first 4 steps. Step 1, real world. Let's identify the aspect of the real world that is under investigation, right? So something, right, DNA, right, the structure of some uh, molecule or some biological entity, right? Uh, so some process, right, reproduction, so on. Um, this real world part, you want to avoid sort of model specific language, right? So we're not assuming anything about which model is correct, right? We're just talking about the world itself and the phenomenon we want to investigate. So you'll largely be using everyday terms in this part of your analysis. You might need a few scientific terms, right? So when we're trying to understand the structure of DNA, you'll have to use the term DNA, right? But you may not need to talk about a double helix or something, right? Part of the model. Okay, step 2. Um, Now you describe the model, right? So identify a theoretical model whose fit with the real world is at issue, right? The model that's being proposed that we're wondering whether it fits. Here, you might have to use some scientific terminology, right? That's specific to the model. If you're visual and you want to draw a diagram, that's fine, right? Again, if it was the double helix model of DNA, draw a helix. That's fine, right? If that helps you to sort of clarify what the model is. Um, Step 3, now we need to identify the prediction of the model. Right? So uh, the prediction is not only going to be entailed by the model itself, right? Some specific thing. Um, it's also needs to involve an experimental setup, right? That is going to facilitate this interaction with the world that will produce the data, right? So given the model and some experimental setup that will help us interact with the world, um, what data should we expect? That's what the prediction will involve. So the data again is joining the model and the world through this experimental setup, and all of those need to be mentioned, right, when you talk about the prediction. Step 4, the data. So what data, once the experiment is done, what are the data? What do we actually see, right? And so those are the 4 steps, right? Now, once you've described those 4, we have an idea of the scientific episode. So now we can evaluate it, right? So what does the data say? In step 5, we ask, is there negative evidence, right? Is there disagreement between the data and the prediction? If not, right? If there is disagreement, here I say if there's not agreement, right? If there's disagreement, then we conclude that the data provide good evidence that the model does not fit the real world, right? Again, we are not going to worry about whether perhaps the prediction was wrong or perhaps the experimental setup was faulty. We're just going to say we're not specialists, right? If the data do not fit the model, if they don't agree with the prediction of the model is bad, doesn't fit the real world, right? And we can stop there if we get negative evidence. Now, if there isn't negative evidence, if the data does agree with the prediction of the model, then we'll move on to step 6, right? So if there's positive evidence, now we need to ask, that's not enough, right? That doesn't mean that the model is true. We need to then ask, pardon me, was the prediction likely to agree with the data even if the model didn't actually fit the real world? Another way of asking this question is there another plausible model that would give us the same prediction? If there is, then it was likely that the agreement would happen either way, right? Now, if we don't have another plausible model, then you conclude no, right? The prediction was not likely to agree if the model were false. And in that case, we can say that the data provides good support that the model fits the real world, right? If we do have another plausible model, then we're going to say that the data are inconclusive. So we're going to sort of repeat this, and we're going to use it with some examples, right? Because again, this is what's going to be on your homework. It will likely appear on the quiz, so you need practice with reading a scientific episode and applying the 6-step method, right? Or 5 steps, again, if there's not agreement between the data and the prediction. So here are our 4 parts. Again, we've got the real world, right? We've got the model. We've got the lines that indicate the relationships between these various parts, right? So the model, right, may or may not fit the real world if the hypothesis is true or false, right? In either case. Below the model is the prediction that is derived from the model, right? Using reasoning, using logic, and then also the sort of experimental setup, right, that you plan to use to interact with the world. The real world is connected to the data through the experiment, right? That's how we interact with the real world. And then down at the bottom, you've got the data and the prediction, and those will either agree or disagree. So if we have agreement or disagreement, we will move on to step 5 and 6, right, to evaluate those. So you'll know, we'll see in the next slide, right? These are in a square because it's not essential which order you do them necessarily, right? You don't get points off if you start with step 2 or something. If that seems more reasonable to you, it's up to you. So then we move on to step 5, right? Do the data and the prediction agree? If not, boom, you're done. Right? The data provide evidence that the model does not fit the real world. If there is agreement, we move on to step 6, and now we have to ask, is there another reasonable model, right? Or another way of saying that, was the prediction likely to agree even if the model was not a good fit? If yes, then the data are inconclusive, right? We just don't know whether the model fits. There's multiple models that could be true. The answer is no, right? There's not another model, and it was very unlikely that we would have seen that data if the model were false. Then we conclude, okay, good evidence that the model does fit the real world. So you get to practice it over and over, look this over in your book following these 6 steps. So as you can see on the diagram, and as I mentioned, the order of the first 4 components isn't crucial. You won't get points off or something if you do them in a different order. I mean, I think they were chosen for a reason, right? I think your default should be to do them in that order. And certainly in step 5 and 6, the order is important. So again, it's probably a good idea to start with the real world. And if you don't have a better idea, I would just stick with that order. But if something else feels more natural to you, it's fine, right? And one thing to look out for, um, it can it can be easy to confuse the prediction with the model, right? So, like for example, the DNA thing, right? The model says it's two chains, right? And there might be tendency to say the prediction is that there are two chains or something like that, right? And that's not it. And if you're confused about what the prediction is and how it's different from the model, think about the experimental setup that's being used, right? So in Watson and Crick's case, it's the X-ray photograph, right? So the prediction is actually a certain pattern will be seen right on the X-ray photograph that's predicted by the model. Okay, so when you've done this correctly, there's three possible outcomes, right? Um, there might be You might conclude that the data provides evidence that the model does not fit the world, right? And you stop at step 5 in that case. Um, if you've moved on to step 6, there's two possibilities. You might find that the data provides evidence that the model does fit the world, right? If that's the only plausible model. Or you might conclude that the data is conclusive if there's more than one plausible model. So the idea is whatever the outcome of these three possibilities, the program is going to guide you to the correct conclusion, right? And then you can go about living your life, right? Knowing that you've understood, right, what you should conclude from this report and what effects it has on you. Now, when the data and the prediction disagree, right, the most key steps are steps 3 and 5, right? Step 3, right, you need to make sure that the prediction is actually follows from the model, right? If it doesn't, then the data isn't actually telling you anything about the model, right? So the prediction needs to be actually sort of an actual consequence of the model along with the experimental setup. And then if that part is solid, right, then disagreement in step 5 will tell you, yeah, there's definitely something wrong with the model. And as we said before, in step 3, sometimes that's something you can analyze on yourself. Sometimes that's something you have to leave to the expert. Whether the prediction and the experimental setup are really a good test of the model or really are nailed by the model. Sometimes you can tell yourself by a little thinking. Sometimes you have to be an expert. So I think we've gone through all this. So yeah. All right. So let's look at a few examples, right? And hopefully these will help you uh, doing the exercises, right? Um, so here's one report. I'm sort of summarizing it. You can read it in the text as well. So there's this group of turtles, and it's like kind of impressive and puzzling, right? They swim from the coast of Brazil to an island that's like 1,200 miles away to go lay their eggs. Um, and it seems sort of puzzling. Why go that far, right? And one uh, one explanation that was put out there was, well, you know what? These turtle species have existed for a long, long time. Um, and there was a point when the continents were much closer together, right? So what if it was the case that like 40 million years ago, when Brazil and this island were much closer together, the turtles were just coming to a nearby island to lay their eggs, and then gradually, right, the seafloor spread, the continents, right, spread apart, and so every year they swim a little further, just a tiny bit, a little bit further, and then over generations, millions of years, it stretches out to a 1,200-mile trek. So that's the model, right? That's the theory. Um, and recent genetic analysis, again, this is in the report. They compared the DNA of these turtles to like related species, um, and they concluded that the DNA between these turtles and other turtles is just too similar to have branched off 40 million years ago, right? So they are a distinct sort of genetic group of turtles, but they probably branched off closer to like 40,000 years ago, right? So that's the report, right? So now we have to sort of dig through this and find the real world, right, thing under investigation, find the model, find the prediction, find the data, right? And it's not like explicit here exactly, right? It's all in there, but it takes a little work. So we'll walk you through this example. All right, step 1, real world. So the real world subject matter, sort of the question, the puzzle they're trying to answer is like this population of turtles that migrates all the way from Brazil to Ascension Island, 1,200 miles away. And the questions we want to know is like, how does that happen, right? Why are they doing that? How did they come to make such a long, difficult? Okay, so that is the real world thing. It's these actual turtles and their actual behavior. Right? Step two, the model. So the model under investigation here was the proposal that, well, they started visiting the island 40 million years ago, right, when it was closer to Brazil, and then over millions of years as the seafloor spread, they just kept making that same trip. It kept getting a little longer and longer. Now, this is a model, right, because it's an imaginary world, as we said, right? We don't know whether this is what really happened, right? It's a possible thing that could have happened, right? So that's what makes it a model. Now, obviously, they haven't built something out of sticks. Um, Again, different models look like different things, right? But you can sort of keep in mind that a model is an imaginary world. It's a possible way things could have gone. So what's the prediction of that model? Um, what's the experimental setup, right? Well, we have a hint to the experimental setup in that they looked at the DNA of these turtles, right? So the prediction must have something to do um, with something you can find in the DNA. So the prediction is that you can figure out the age of this turtle population, right? These ones that were swimming to the island. How long ago did they sort of branch off as their own little group? Um, it should have been 40 million years ago. Right? So what is the data? Um, well, the data is that by examining the DNA of eggs from these turtles and then eggs from other groups of turtles, um, we can kind of determine sort of how long it takes for a certain amount of differences between the DNA, right? And so these turtles are not like 4 million years. Was it 40 million? They're not millions of years worth different than other turtles, right? The longer they've been apart, the more different the DNA will be. This DNA they found it's different, but it's not like that different. It's like 40,000 years different, right? Um, okay, so that's the data, right? Uh, so now we have to ask ourselves, does the data support, right? Does it agree with the prediction or not? Well, no. The prediction was that uh, this population, right, started to separate from other populations of turtles millions of years ago, right? And the data says now it happened about 40,000 years ago, right? So the prediction is about 1,000 times greater than the data indicates. Therefore, the data provides clear evidence that the model fails to fit the real world, right? And we stop at step 5. All right, let's try another example, this one of positive evidence, right? So this one is about the unconscious mind, right? So here's again, just the description that you might read in the newspaper article, and then we have to sort of dig through it and find all the parts. Uh, it's been debated, like in the past, whether there are unconscious mental processes, right? Um, and this recent study claims to provide evidence that there is unconscious visual perception. Marcel claims to have demonstrated that there exists unconscious reading, right? So what he does is he flashes a word on a screen for a very short time and then masks the word by surrounding it with nonsense words. I have a picture here of a different kind of mask. I couldn't find the exact kind of mask that Marcel uses, right? But this is what they do. They flash the word for a short period of time and then they display some other kind of nonsense stuff to sort of like um, up the retention of the the word in your visual memory, right? Your sort of short-term visual memory. So like if you if they didn't do that, it would be much easier, right? So this is a way of like making it a real quick thing, sort of subliminal, right? Flashing of the word. So you do this, right? And you ask people, hey, did you see the word? And they say, no, I didn't see anything, right? I saw the nonsense. It flashed so fast they didn't even register it, and then the mask popped up, right? And um, so you say, did you see it? No, didn't see it. No conscious experience of it. But when you ask them to guess which of the two words looked like the masked words, right? So they say, suppose the masked word was blood, right? and they ask you, well, which one of these looks like the word? I know you say you didn't see it, but just take a guess, right? Flood and weak, which one? Well, it turns out subjects 90% of the time pick the right one. They pick flood like 90% of the time. Okay, so that's the description. So again, let's go through this. We got to find what's the part of the real world they're investigating, right? What's the model? What's the prediction? What's the data? Okay, the real world, what we're investigating is the human mind, and particularly human perception, right? And whether there exists unconscious perception. So what's the model? Well, it's a bit vague, right? There's not a lot of detail, but the one thing they do tell us about the model is the model says there is unconscious perception, right? There are unconscious parts of the mind. Okay, so that's a model, right? Underdescribed as it is, it does tell us something, right? So what's the prediction? Um, well, again, uh, it's a little vague, but the prediction seems to be that if unconscious perception exists, then subjects ought to be able to perceive and remember words that they didn't consciously identify, right? If you use the masking, right, this is the experimental setup, designed to make the word appear before them, but for them not to consciously experience it, right? Then, nonetheless, if there is unconscious perception, they should nonetheless be able to make accurate guesses about it. So that's the prediction, right? Well, what's the data? It turns out that in these unconscious reading experiments, they were able to make correct guesses 90% of the time, even when they couldn't consciously report the word. So, does that constitute negative evidence? No, that's exactly the prediction, right? That they would be able to be accurate about things they couldn't consciously perceive, right? If there is unconscious perception. So the prediction and the data seem to agree, right? Is there positive evidence? They don't discuss any other models, right? And 90% is pretty impressive, right? I mean, you could try to think of what another model would be. Maybe they were just totally guessing every time and they just lucked out. That seems pretty unlikely, right? That you would get 90% correct guesses if they weren't getting some sort of information, right, from the word that was flashed. Um, this is my area of philosophy of mind, so I can think of all kinds of different sort of other models, right? But I'm not going to wade into it. Right? But based from what they give you, um, it seems like, yeah, it seems to support the data, right? So again, note that in this episode, the model was very vague. It really only gave us one bit of information, right? But the data was fairly impressive. 90% correct is like, um, again, the model only kind of made one prediction that you'd be able to accurately perceive stuff that you can't consciously report, and it really did seem to support that, right, with that 90% correct. Okay, so this I think we conclude, yeah, this is support for the model. The model does seem to be a good fit for the world. All right, we'll take a moment to do the attendance quiz. The question is relevant to this last example. It's kind of a very easy, well, very quick sort of yes or no question, but the question is designed to make you maybe think a little bit about something. So take your time to get this. I'll pause for a moment. And then, of course, if this is not enough time for you to copy down this link, you can always pause the video. Again, please include your PID before the letter answer and use the letters that I put in the question. They're specifically designed not to be A, B, and C, so that I can kind of get a sense that you actually did watch this and like follow the rules instead of like just you're getting the link from someone else. And again, you'll have to log into Microsoft Office, but it should be free through UCSD. Okay, I'm gonna move on. All right, another case again, and this text seems to want to harp on this idea of uh, the greenhouse effect or global warming sort of being inconclusive. Of course, it's sort of not aged very well. I mean, even at this time, I don't think it aged that well. Um, Everyone, I think, is all scientists are agreed that global warming is a thing and greenhouse gases are responsible. But nonetheless, it's an interesting sort of episode. We just take it as an episode at the time. This is 1988, right? Before we had quite the same consensus, right? Okay, so James Hansen, right? So again, here's the report you get in the newspaper, the magazine. So that the scientist named James Hansen, he notices that uh, in the 80s, in recent years, been pretty hot, right? 1980, 83, 86, 87 are like the four warmest years of the century, right? That seems significant. That's a lot of very hot years all clustered together. So he argues that the greenhouse effect, which is the trapping of solar heat by gases in the atmosphere, was responsible, right? Um, some other scientists at the time didn't see this as sufficient evidence, right? Uh, and they designed some computer models to determine the likelihood of such fluctuations, right? Could it just be pure chance that you would get four warmest years of the century all together like that? Lorenz model, which is a model of global climate, global temperature, like a computer model, uh, they ran it back 400 years, and they found that yeah, actually, they got several clusters of these types of years, right? So just without any global warming, just by pure chance, you're going to get some of these clusters of like really hot years. Right, so that's the report as we get it, right? So now we need to pick through it and find all the parts. So step one, what is the real world phenomena under investigation? Uh, the climate of the Earth, strictly speaking, the temperature, right, of the Earth. Step two, the model. Well, two models are mentioned, right? But the model that's being investigated, the model that's being evaluated here, is the greenhouse model. So this is Hansen's claim that the Earth's atmosphere, right, is acting like a windows in a greenhouse. It's trapping light and heat. Carbon dioxide and other gases are increasing effects. So, what is the prediction of this model? Well, the prediction is that average temperatures should be increasing. Right? There's more gases now than there were in the past, more trapping of heat, so the temperature is going to go up and up. Not enough detail in this model to sort of predict the specific temperature on a specific date or anything like that. It's just saying, on average, it's going to be getting hotter. So what is the data? Well, among the data, right, were the 4 years in the 1980s that he noted, right? If the four warmest years of the century are all in the same decade, um, the model would predict that, right? More hot years now as opposed in the past. Right? Okay, so what is the sort of experimental setup there, right? Well, it's just a thermometer, right, along with probably a little math. They don't get into enough detail to say whether they were like taking the temperature in whatever Connecticut or if they meant like the average temperature of the whole globe and so on, right? They don't give us enough detail for that, but nonetheless, it's enough for us to distinguish between the model and then the data. All right, so now that we've got those figured out, we can move on to step 5 and 6 and evaluate the model. Right? Again, the model is the greenhouse gas model, greenhouse effect. So, is there negative evidence? No, the data, right, which is there's a lot of hot years in 1980, is what the model would predict. Right? It would predict more hot years in 1980 than there were in 1900 or whatever. Okay, so is the and is now we move on to step 6, right? So there is agreement, but is there the question now for step 6? Is there another plausible model, right? And here it seems like there is, right? There's an explicit model, this computer model, the Lorenz model, right? And the Lorenz model produced the same sorts of fluctuations, right, at sort of different parts throughout the centuries, right? So on that model, it does predict that there's will be clusters of hot years, right? But that model doesn't involve any sort of greenhouse effect of overall rise in temperature. So what we should conclude here then is that the data are inconclusive, right? We have more than one model that predicts the data. Doesn't necessarily mean the model's false, right? It just means we don't have strong support for it, right? And now we know in hindsight the model was true, right? At the time they weren't sure. Now notice that the model produced, right, these temperatures, those aren't data, right? Um, the data is the actual temperature recorded, right, on the planet, right? Um, and the question is, do both models predict it? And the model did make predictions about the temperature. Right? So always be careful. Data must always be produced by interaction with the world. Okay, so those are the examples. We have a few more things to say. I think we'll come in close to 50 minutes here, right? So it shouldn't be too much longer. And again, if we go long, I'll make the next one a little shorter. So some more things to say uh, about model evaluations. There's this issue of crucial experiments, which have sort of had an outsized sort of gotten a lot of attention when they occur in the history of science. They're kind of flashy. And then also we'll talk about model development. What do you do if your model is false? Or at least we have good evidence that there's no good fit. Where do you go from there? So we'll talk a bit about those two things. So what's a crucial experiment? These are experiments that are thought to sort of decide the fate of two theories or two models in sort of one fell swoop with a single experiment. We call these crucial experiments. What does a crucial experiment look like? Well, suppose you have two models of some real world phenomenon, right? If you can design an experiment such that uh, you have sort of two very narrow readings, say on a ranges of readings on experimental apparatus, and you see this model here, so or this sort of this diagram. If model one is true, it predicts right a reading over here on the left, and if model two is true, my head's over it, but it's symmetrical. It predicts a reading uh, on the other side. I'm going to grab some water real quick. Oh, all right. So again, since each model sort of their prediction falls within a pretty narrow range and they're both pretty far from each other, so it's very unlikely, right, that model two is not going to produce data on the other side. Um, you could potentially run one experiment that'll test both models at once. Now, it's pretty obvious here how the experiment could fail to be decisive, right? So if the reading ends up somewhere in the middle, not in either of those ranges, then all you conclude is you don't really have any good evidence for either model. But if the experiment does produce a reading in one little range and not the other, then you can say I support for one model and I've got evidence that the other model is false. So here's an example of something that we could consider a crucial experiment, right? So it's about mutations in genes, right? So we know that sort of evolution and other things happen just by sort of mutations in our DNA, right? They'll change sort of randomly, and you'll get a generation with attributes that don't necessarily come from either mother or father, right? Um, so we knew that happened, but in the 1940s we didn't know quite that much about how it happened, right? Now they also happen to know at that time that certain types of viruses can attack and kill bacteria, right? It's been shown in the lab. But they also noticed that when you do this, some of the bacteria will survive, right? And when they do, they seem to produce offspring that also survive the viral attack, right? These viruses that kill bacteria are called bacteriophages. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I think I. So the question is, okay, how do these mutations work? Um, is it when the virus attacks the bacterium and it survives? Is that what makes its offspring right, more resistant? Does something about the attack itself cause the mutation? Or are these mutations just random? So Delbruck and Luria designed an experiment to answer this question, right? Decide between the two models, um, right? A model that says, well, I'll read it before we get into analyzing. I should finish reading the thing. Okay. So they took a number. Let's say they took 20 bacteria cultures, right? And these little pictures of bacteria cultures. So they're allowed to develop, and then at a certain point, they're all injected with the virus, with the bacteriophage. They're allowed to develop some more. So the idea is this: if the mutations were caused by the actual virus, then we should expect similar numbers of resistant bacteria in each culture, right? They all sort of got the same treatment. the same amount of virus went in, so they should all have the same sort of effect afterwards. But if the mutations were random, then you should expect, and the viruses had nothing to do with it, then you'll sort of expect a random amount of resistant bacteria in each culture, right? The number is just going to simply depend on how early the relevant mutation happened and how long it had time to reproduce. So we do have two models happening. You could try to run an analysis for each model, but we couldn't also just do it. So we'll just do one. So step one, the real world. So the real world object of this study is the process by which mutations arise in bacteria. Right? We want to know, how do these mutations happen? What causes them? And we got two models, right? So there's one, call it the causal model, which says, well, the virus somehow causes the mutation, right? The other model is mutations just happen randomly, right? So we got the two models. Each model has a different prediction, right? So the causal model predicts that you'll see roughly the same number of resistant bacteria in all the cultures, right? Um, and the virus, roughly same amount of virus introduced to all the cultures, so you got the same cause in each one, you should have the same effect in each one. On the random mutation model, right, you should see sort of random variation in the numbers of resistant bacteria. So two different predictions. So data, they ended up finding actually a wide variation in the number of resistant bacteria. So this was what was predicted by the random mutation model, the second model. So is there negative evidence? Yeah, well, we got two models, right? So there's some negative evidence and some positive evidence. So they agree with the chance hypothesis and they disagree with the prediction derived from the causal hypothesis, right? So at step 5, we have good evidence that the causal hypothesis, right, that the viruses cause the mutations. Now, because we also have positive evidence, right, we'll go on to analyze that for the other model, right? So do we have another plausible model, right? Well, no, the only other model we considered was the one that we just said was supported, right? So it looks to us like chance hypothesis is supported, right? There does seem to be good evidence. The chance hypothesis is correct, and the chance model is a good fit for the mutations. Okay, so you've just disproven your model, right? What do you do? Well, there's a couple options, right? You can adjust your model slightly, right, to take account of the data, right, to make it agree with the data. You could alter it dramatically, right, or you can just throw it out together in favor of a new model. These counts as model development, right? In either case, scientists are not going to just give up, right? They're going to keep working and try to find the correct. So this is not the same thing as a crucial experiment where you're testing models against each other, right? Um, in this process, the later models depend on the previous models, right? It's a development. In for the purposes of our sort of like method of analysis, we can sort of distinguish two forms of model development: development with or without experimental test of the new model. Right? Here I have a old Aristotelian or Ptolemaic model of the solar system, right, with the Earth at the center there. You see that? So let's suppose we are looking at model development without the test of the new model. Well, here's what it looks like. You have an old model presented. You have an experimental test of the old model that yields negative results, right? There's a lack of agreement between the prediction and the data. And then you come up with a new model that accounts for the negative evidence, right? But you don't test it yet, right? So in that case, an analysis of that report would just look like this: a 5-stage analysis of the old model, right? There is no analysis of the new model because you haven't done an experimental test. Just monkeying with the model to make it fit the data you found, for us, doesn't count, right, as support. You have to make a new prediction to get support for that model. Suppose we have the case where there's model development with a test of the new model, right? So that would look like this. You've got the old model, right? It's presented. You do an experimental test of the old model, yields negative evidence. Now we have a new model, right? We formulated it accounts for all the negative evidence, right? So here we've got our new, right, heliocentric model of the solar system. And now we test, right, the results of an experiment. I'm not going through, we're sort of slow on time. We've hit the 15-minute mark. I'm not going to go through an example of this here. It doesn't come up a lot later, but it's covered in the text. So I want to go through it. Maybe if you can think of an example of this to discuss in discussion or something, it could be interesting. So you got two ways, right, that model development with testing of the new model could go, right? So you got the old model, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you find lack of agreement, so there's no reason to go to 6. You develop the new model, experimental test of that, right? Now, if all goes well and the data and prediction agree for the new model, then you make it all the way to step 6, the new model. Right? If there's disagreement, right, if the new model is not supported by the evidence, right, if the new prediction, then you end up with only 5 steps on the new one, and you need to start thinking of a newer model. Okay, just a couple more slides. I think we'll come in under 55 minutes. So here's a case of model development, real quick, just a little example. So after the Earth sort of spins off from the rest of the solar system, right, about 4.4 billion years ago, we want to know how soon did the Earth sort of cool down? It was originally very hot, and so eventually it cools down enough to have liquid water, continents, right, things like that, looking like the Earth. So initially, scientists thought that this cooling process took about 0.7 billion years, right? Examination of a 4.4 billion year old grain of zircon reveals that it could only have formed in much cooler temperatures than were previously believed to exist at that time. So this led scientists to revise their estimate of the cooling process, now estimating that the Earth cooled below the boiling point of water around 0.1 billion years after its formation. So what is the analysis here? Well, the real world, the aspect of the real world we're looking at is sort of the rate of the cooling of the early Earth, right? What's the model? Well, the old model is that the cooling of the Earth took about 0.7 billion years. What's the prediction of that model? Well, it predicts that if you looked at the chemistry of a grain of zircon, you should find evidence that the temperature at the time of the grain's formation would be too high for water to condense, right? If you looked at the grain of zircon from 4.4 billion years ago, you would say, oh, it's too hot. What's the data? Well, in fact, the chemistry of the rock revealed that that really old piece of zircon could only have formed in a relatively low temperature environment. So step 5, is this negative evidence? Yeah. The data does not agree with the prediction, right? So the data provides evidence that the old model doesn't fit the real world. Now we have a new model which accounts for this evidence by revising the rate of cooling, right, to match the data, right? Now, again, this doesn't constitute evidence for the new model. The new model was designed specifically to account for the data, right? We need a new experimental test to determine whether the new model fits the world. So this doesn't count as a crucial experiment, right? Even though it looks like, oh, well, we got one model, right? The data doesn't support, we got another model it does. Well, the other model, the new model, it didn't have a new experimental test. It was explicitly designed to accommodate the data. So for us, that's not counting as support, it's counting as a crucial experiment. So that's just one example of one way, right, model development can be looked at and analyzed. It's sort of the first example you saw where all you have is the old model, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, no agreement, and then we have the development of the new model, but it's development without experimental tests. All right, we're in at 54.5 minutes. I will call it for there. I'll try to make the next lecture a little bit shorter, and hopefully this will give you what you need to now practice, do the homework, and practice this process.